So I'm sure you guys are wondering where the votes went for the test tomorrow. The answer is open book, open notebook on a 2-to-1 vote. So that means that you guys are going to come in on Friday. You will not be able to have your books and notebooks while you complete the essay. And then, once we start doing the multiple choice, then you get to have those. So, just keep that in mind. Yes? Yes, it is. Yes, there's only 2, so you only have to write one of them. So, and one of them has to do with the section you guys did on Thursday night of 2 weeks ago. That would be when you had the quiz, and it's on the 3 different art forms of neoclassical, Baroque, and Rococo. Okay, we are going to complete Chapter 5, Section 5, and set ourselves up rather nicely for tomorrow being a review day. So, without further ado, let's start with the Tudor dynasty. First of all, the Tudors are going to be the royal family of England for a while. Probably the most famous members of the Tudor dynasty are Henry VIII and his daughters. Granted, he did have a son that was actually King of England, but he tends to get overlooked because of the kind of shenanigans that happened under the reign of Mary, otherwise known as Bloody Mary, and Queen Elizabeth I, the queen who ruled over England in the so-called Golden Age. Though to be honest, I would really question that. The reign of Victoria seems to be much more England's Golden Age, but I digress. So, the problem that we're going to come across starts with the line of succession. How do you determine succession in England? You guys know? Whenever the king dies, who becomes the next king of England? Firstborn son. Okay, you guys know who actually came up with that idea? Who is it that said, this is law, this is how it's going to go down? Henry VIII, actually. He was concerned about a line of succession. Generally speaking, succession was kind of a muddy topic. Most of the time, the person who became king was the person who had the biggest army. Now, naturally, the firstborn son usually had an advantage there, but it wasn't a guarantee. Now, he's trying to make it guaranteed, but people more or less kind of throw that out the window. So, generally speaking, we're going to go with the firstborn son, but we're going to run into some problems along the way. And it's going to be pretty obvious why when we get to Elizabeth and Mary, and indeed even Henry VIII's son, who I think is named Richard or James, but I could be wrong. That's how much I know about it. Anyhow, so let's talk about this heir in question. So we have a queen on the throne who does not have a child. So it goes. Let's actually, instead of talking hypotheticals, let's do this little graphic. I can put up over here on the board and maybe make a little bit of sense out of this. So let's start with our pal Henry. Yes. As noted, he has 3 kids. with Mary. Now, an important distinction. When Henry was born, he was named Henry, not Henry VIII. You don't get the number until you're crowned king or queen. So he was actually just Prince Henry until his brother gets it, and he is crowned king. So he gets the crown. Alrighty? So when Henry dies, the crown passes to his firstborn son, right? Makes sense, yeah? Except here's the thing is, whatever his name is, dies before having an heir. So the crown, what does it do? Where does it go? Well, you think, but actually it has to go back to Henry first. That's an important distinction. So it goes to Henry. It can't sit on his head because, he's dead and all. So it comes instead to Mary. So now she has the crown. Problem. She doesn't actually have a child. She tries to, but she dies before she can have a kiddo. So the crown cannot go to a successor. So where does it go back again? Back to poor dead Henry. And back over to Elizabeth. Now here's the problem. Does Elizabeth have a child? No. She didn't even get married. So again, the crown goes back to Henry. Now why that whole thing mattered? Now that it's with Henry, he has no more children that he can try to go sit on their heads. So it goes back from Henry to Henry's dad, who of course is also dead. So then it goes to other relatives of Henry, but he has no brothers and sisters. So it goes up again, right? Now we're starting to get the grandparents, comes over sideways and goes down another chain. It eventually works its way over here to Henry's whatever cousin, who is part of another family, the House of Stuart. So we have a new royal family, yes? So the crown is always trying to wiggle its way around to the rightful heir as is dependent upon these criteria. Living children, yes or no, back a step. Any living children, yes or no, back a step. Until it eventually finds someone alive to be the queen. So, that's kind of what's going on here, just understanding that. Now, as far as Parliament is concerned, Parliament's existence is to limit the powers of the king. This goes way back to some of the earliest instances of kings pretty much screwing things up for people. The nobles didn't particularly like the king being an absolute monarch, so they would attempt to limit the king's power. England is especially well known for this instance with the signing of the Magna Carta. With Parliament, anytime a king wants to do something, such as raise taxes, or even to gather an army and go to war, they pretty much need to have the support of the Parliament. I say pretty much because they can actually go and fight wars by themselves if they want to, but their chances of success are fairly limited. So they're going to raise the money necessary for having a strong army. They need Parliament to help raise taxes. Now, why this is important? If you can finesse Parliament, you can pretty much do whatever you want. If you can get them on your side, they'll okay just about anything. King Henry does that. He's great with Parliament, as is pretty much all of the other members of the House of Tudor, all of his descendants. When we get to the Stuarts, on the other hand, the Stuarts are going to be almost unanimously bad with Parliament. And so these clashes over, who has the power to do what is going to ultimately result in civil war. But before we get there, let's talk about where some of these problems reside. As we established, when Elizabeth dies, she leaves no direct heir. So they pass to her closest relatives, the Stuarts. And one of the first problems that the Stuarts are going to have has to do with money. James I, who was the first Stuart king of England, regularly fought wars and had to try to cover an expensive court. You guys remember Louis XIV, the King of France, who built Versailles and had a really ostentatious party life, spending huge amounts of money and driving the country in debt? Well, the thing is, that sort of became the expectation of a monarch. And so James was basically trying to keep up. And things are going to go really wrong for him in that regards. The kings of England during this era are going to be renowned for spending huge sums of money. And Parliament is not going to be really happy with him. So Parliament refuses to play ball with him. And so in response, he dissolves the Parliament on the 31st of December, 1610. Now, he can actually do that. Parliament can be called and disbanded, even technically to this day, though it's fairly limited on how you can go about actually doing that. And I say they can disband it. That's a big filled with asterisks. It's not just like they get rid of Parliament or like Queen Elizabeth II is not going to be like, Parliament, see you later, and now I'm absolute monarch and tee. It doesn't work that way. But if memory serves, whenever the prime minister is elected, they are actually disbanding the previous parliament and creating a new one. So it's really more of the way the language is worded. Anyways, it's kind of irrelevant. But anyways, one of the big problems that James has is going to be from Protestants. You see, one of the things that we have to understand about the Anglican Church, when Henry formed it, is it's really sort of sitting on the fence about whether they want to be Protestant or just Catholics of another name. If you look at more Protestant nations, like, say, the Netherlands, they've got a very different outlook than what the Church of England does. The Church of England is actually pretty similar to the Catholic faith, just with certain smaller differences. The Protestants in the country didn't like that the way things were going, so they were pressuring James to become even more Protestant, which he resisted, so they basically were in revolt against him. So he needed to raise an army to suppress the Protestant dissenters and basically form the church along his own way. Now, he does end up creating a vernacular English Bible, the King James Bible, but nevertheless, he's going to need to call on Parliament in order to get the funds necessary for this war. And so we have the reinstitution of Parliament, who's not going to go away quietly. So they're going to force him to sign some documents limiting his powers, which let's talk about that for just a second. One of the things I find very interesting about the United States is the Constitution is really bad at explaining exactly what rights you do and do not have. For instance, let's talk briefly about the First Amendment. You guys have the right to freedom of speech. Okay? Now, here's the problem with that. I say you have the freedom of speech. What does that really mean to you? What does that mean? What rights do you have in terms of what you can and cannot say? Can you say anything you want?
You can't threaten anyone.
That is true. In fact, you can't threaten anyone. If you are recorded by the police saying, I am going to kill this person, that could be used against you in a court of law, depending on how they record you saying that. You see, there's certain rights we have that are spelled out by the Bill of Rights, and other rights that are kind of murky. For instance, you have the right to privacy. Ish, maybe? I don't know. For instance, if someone puts a camera up into your windows recording what's going on in your house, they're going to be in trouble with the police. But at the same time, is it legal for the government to record your phone conversations? It's murky. They can in certain circumstances, but those circumstances aren't particularly well defined. So, while yes, to some extent you have the right of freedom, to other extents, no, you really don't. It just sort of depends on your interpretation, which is terrible when it comes to the law. Yet you don't want wiggle room in the laws, because that's how you create loopholes and people get away with crimes. So, the thing of it is it's really hard to nail down some of these things. And that's where we're going to have the creation of the United States of the Bill of Rights. This is us explaining what the rights are, and then we further explain that with other forms of laws. But suffice it to say, this is before we even get to a lot of this sort of stuff. And what the king can and cannot do is kind of vague-ish in regards to what the king actually does. Part of it's going to be how this is enforced. And so we're going to lead to yet more problems. So, when Charles I becomes King of England, he basically tries to rule as an absolute monarch. The way he goes about authorizing what he does is essentially to say, I do what I want. If people disagree with that or fight him on it, he just imprisons them and just forgets they exist, kind of thing. The type of stuff that's illegal in the United States. You guys have probably heard of the Miranda rights, yes? You have the right to remain silent and all that stuff. Well, part of that is they have to actually tell you what you are being arrested for. They can bring you in for questioning without telling you that, but they cannot arrest you. They cannot just put you in jail without charging you for a crime. The amount of time they can keep you in holding is limited. This is to protect the right of habeas corpus, a right that was basically not granted to many people throughout history. That's an important right when it comes to democracy, because the government can just imprison people for no reason other than we don't like them. Then what's to stop the government from imprisoning people because they said something contrary to what the government wants you to say? How do you protect rights whenever you just be in prison for no reason? So, we're kind of touchy on that. This is one of the reasons people were upset when it came to imprisoning people who were suspected of terrorism but not actually tried for anything. So it's kind of, again, murky gray areas. Now, the other thing that gets them in trouble is collecting taxes without authorization. Taxes are a big deal. Who collects them and who counts them, and most importantly, who is it that is responsible for distributing them, is kind of basically how the government functions. And so he is stepping beyond his means in doing this. The thing is, he's not as efficient as he needs to be with it, and doesn't really have the power to do what he needs to do in order to have enough tax money for his purposes. So he is forced again to call on Parliament in 1628 in order to raise the taxes, and in response they say, we'll let you raise the taxes, but you have to sign the Petition of Rights. There was a series of rights aimed at limiting the king's power, one of the most important of which is the writ of habeas corpus. Now, Charles does sign it, but he basically ignores it. And because of that, he basically tells Parliament he's unwilling to compromise. In response, Parliament basically vows to not let him get away with this again. So whenever he has to call on them again, they essentially refuse to go away. They actually, as a form of sort of rebellion, when he dissolves Parliament, they still keep meeting. They refuse to be cowed, so to speak. And so it's known as the Long Parliament. And one of the things that the Long Parliament does, they start putting on trial King Charles's supporters. They put them on trial for things like treason or gross corruption and negligence. Some of these guys are even executed. So think about this for a second. The Parliament has executed supporters of the king. It doesn't matter if it's legal. From the king's standpoint, they're challenging his power, and thus a war begins between Parliament and the king and his supporters. Now, the other thing to understand about this is that Parliament is actually two houses. It's a bicameral legislature. Just like we have a bicameral legislature, only we have the Senate and House of Representatives, which are both electoral positions. We elect people for them. In Parliament, the House of Commons was elected, but the House of Lords was hereditary. You guys know what the word hereditary means? It meant it was inherited. It was passed on from father to son. So the only way for you to be part of the House of Lords was to be born a lord, a nobleman. To become a member of House of Commons, you have to campaign to be elected. Now, here's the thing. The House of Lords had basically a one-to-one vote with the House of Commons. So basically, if House of Commons wanted something and House of Lords did it, they could overrule the House of Commons. So it was really not a great relationship. And the House of Lords did not necessarily always get along with the House of Commons. So for the most part, the House of Lords are going to continue to support the king because that's where all of their power comes from, is the king saying so. So what we have over here is the House of Commons versus the Loyalists. The Loyalists are basically all those who support the king. Now, we're going to name two other names for these guys. The House of Commons in this war are going to be known as the Roundheads. It's a really silly name. I'll get to what that means in a second. The Loyalists are going to be known as the Cavaliers. Now, these distinctions basically have to do with hats. It's the War of the Hats. Roundhead refers to a round hat. Your book mentions a haircut. I've certainly heard that as well, so I guess it could really be either. But first I've heard of the hat, so that's what I'm going with. Those are the hats. The commoner's hat, the hat that was basically ubiquitous throughout history. It was just a white brimmed hat, pretty simple, pretty easy, laid back. Something that was more about function over form. Whereas Cavaliers, this was a fashion at the time. It involved basically, I'll show you the photos here in just a second, but kind of the focal point was a hat that was similar to that round hat I was talking about, but you would cock up the side. And basically you would flip this side up further, like a fashionable angle, and you put a pin in it. And the pin could be all kinds of nonsense. Jewelry, they had like gem-encrusted ones. The most common was what's called a cockade. These are technically all cockades, but I mean to say the most common ones were political symbols. So for instance, we have political parties, their symbols, their animals, things like that. If you belong to a political party, you put that on your cockade. That hat back there actually has a cockade on it as well, although it's not a cocked hat. The reason is that these became symbolic of one's sort of inclinations in society. For instance, this is an American hat, the Federal Eagle, and then the eagle up here on the stamps of this cockade says E Pluribus Unum. This is, the fashion statement, which is anything. And actually, what eventually happened is people started sewing these hats on all three sides, and it would create a tricorn. That's where that came from. But they can put feathers in it. They can all do all kinds of nonsense. If you want a great example of it, look at Puss in Boots. That hat he wears, big feather, that's what we're talking about. It's a Cavalier-style hat. And that sort of mentality was also a big part of Cavalier attitude. The word nowadays, when you say someone is Cavalier, it's almost like not really worried about, death. They kind of laugh in the face of danger, that sort of thing. Like, whatever. It's kind of flippant in a way. Not to celebrate when the craziness. That was Cavalier. And, part of that comes from, the time period. Honor was really kind of important to nobles. So if you talk about, duels, dueling culture, this is what we're talking about. Even though it's technically illegal. Like, if you got caught dueling someone, you'd both be executed. There's a famous story of two guys who hate each other so bad, they were going to duel, and so the king said, fine, you you guys can meet here at this time. And they did, and there was a gallows set up, and the king was just sitting in a chair, and they're like, oh, what's the gallows for? It's for the winner. Because they're going to hang whoever won. So they decided not to fight after all. It's a smart move. But anyways, it did happen. And there was a lot of instances of nobles killing each other. Anyways, fun stuff, right? Interestingly enough, though, not all duels were to the death. That's a common misconception because it's sort of more romantic. You see a lot of romantic art. For instance, two guys dueling over a lady, and one of them getting killed and all that sort of stuff. More often than not, duels were actually fought between people to the first blood, which could still actually prove lethal, mind you, so you could die from infection. But it was really just to stick the other person, and essentially it was a way of kind of like wounding the other person, and you got to feel better about yourself. And what also happened quite often is after fighting a duel, the two guys who fought the duel would go drinking together and become best friends. So it's just kind of like, two guys punch each other and now they're friends. That totally happens quite frequently. And in some cases, it was more about stating a point. You guys know about the death of Alexander Hamilton, for instance. He ended up fighting a duel with Aaron Burr. And basically what happened is Hamilton was there to prove a point. And so what happens is whenever you're there to prove a point, if you're shooting a gun, you would basically, instead of taking fire and shooting at your opponent, you would shoot up in the air. And so that's what Alexander Hamilton did. He shot up in the air and said, the matter is settled. And Aaron Burr's like, no, it's not. And he shoots him, kills him. It's like, well, there you go. But anyways. So back to the House of Commons. So the House of Commons refuses to dissipate, and essentially, by trying and executing some of the king's ministers, he responds by marching his army on the House of Commons. Now they get a notification before this happens and scramble. So they slip out of Charles's fingers and vow revenge. The war has begun, and we have these two sides fighting. Now here's the problem for the Roundheads. The Cavaliers are made up of the nobility, which going back to the Middle Ages were the guys who were actually fighting wars. Now, it's not to say the commoners didn't, they absolutely did, but sort of the main power of Europe was in the nobility. They were the ones who were riding cavalry, after all, and they were sort of the heavy troopers, the sort of shock troopers, if you will. So it was the military elite versus a bunch of guys who really didn't have that much experience. So they ended up hiring somebody to become a general for their armies who's named Oliver Cromwell. And he is going to have to work with a new type of army to even have a chance. You see, up until this point, the military relied on the cavalry in order to secure the flanks, in order to protect your flanks and to exploit the flanks of the enemy. He has not really much cavalry. So he needs to create a troop based almost solely on foot soldiers, common soldiers, infantry. And the thing of it is, he's going to work it out. By a combination of pikemen and shot, they're going to be able to protect themselves from the cavalry and be able to effectively engage other infantry. They're able to take advantage of the weaknesses of the cavalry, and ultimately this exploitation is going to result in a change in the way militaries are organized throughout the world. Really, this is going to be the new method of use up and really till we have modern warfare and the use of combined arms. It's going to be quite an interesting thing, actually, and how this kind of evolves. Not to say cavalry stops being used. Cavalry is still very important. It's going to be important really up until the machine gun becomes a thing. But it is possible for infantry units to defend themselves, and that's going to be a big deal. Infantry becomes the main means of military might in Europe after this. This army is called the New Model Army, literally because it's going to be what everyone else is basing their stuff off of. And eventually, they are going to turn the tables on the Cavaliers, and in one battle actually capture Charles I himself. Yes? Oh, it is Wednesday, isn't it? Yeah, I guess you guys did. I forgot about that. So we will call this a day, right here. And I'll be back to this. I'm just going to go ahead and record the rest of this stuff real quick for YouTube, and then you guys can have that tonight if you want to read it. But that's Cromwell right there. That's the Cavaliers. We were talking about the clothes they were wearing. And that's the Roundheads over there on the right with the Morian helmets, the breastplates, and the mortuary swords. But basically, Charles is going to be executed as a traitor. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. And essentially, the Commonwealth is established in England with Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. Eventually, whenever he's overthrown, we're going to have the reinstatement of Charles II. The Puritans basically flee and go to the New World, and it's establishing America. And then we have James II and all that lot basically trying to reinstitute absolute monarchy. Now, eventually what happens is James II is really unpopular. He's a Catholic. And so his daughter and her husband are basically asked to become the next king and queen of England, which they do. And James is just sort of cool with this. I mean, he's not going to fight for the throne, so he just leaves and flees to France, where he lives the rest of his life. And so we have a bloodless exchange of power, which has never been done before. It's like freaking people out. It's so awesome. So it's called the Glorious Revolution because of that. In the end, they're forced to sign a few documents, including the English Bill of Rights, and then later the Religious Freedom Act, which basically guarantees a lot of rights that are important, and you can see them right there on the board. Right, that's it. You guys have the rest of the period as resource.